on this episode of A Tale of Two Hygienists.
I will say that I don't think Trump is like what I would think of as a traditional Republican. He's kind of made his own brand that sometimes he has particular tax policies that are surprising. Like one thing that I think is kind of odd is that he's talked a lot about raising tariffs, which has a specific strategy for trade. But in the end, it's kind of just another tax because prices are going to go up for the consumer anyway. The company has to pay the tax and then they pass that on. The GDP tends to go up the same amount no matter who's president. Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. It's like the economy is just kind of going along. It's affected by a lot of things, but there's not really like one individual person that has almighty power over it.
Yeah, this is a tale, oh yeah, a tale of two hygienists. So there might be only one, bringing the best of dental knowledge, and we do it all with ease. We cover oral health and screening, and preventing gum disease. We're gonna do a lot of learning, and have a little bit of fun working at the dentist. A tale of two hygienists.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A Tale of Two Hygienists, episode number 465. I'm your host, Andrew Johnston. I'm really excited about this episode today. I kind of alluded to this fact in the intro last week, but we will be discussing a topic that is somewhat controversial, but it really shouldn't be controversial. But I know that people's immediate reactions and visceral reactions are just a thing anytime you talk about anything that has to do with politics. So we have on the episode today Amelia, and she wrote an article in Dentistry IQ about what the next presidential administration might mean for dentistry. It's a very well-written article. It was very balanced. Everything was based on fact and things that the incoming administration has said that they were going to be doing. And she's not the only writer on this topic. It has been a very hot topic in dentistry. There have been a lot of really great takes from other authors on the same exact topic. So it's really interesting. Now, one thing we do talk about also, and that's something I think that's going to be very interesting, is that this is all the unknown still. So a lot of this is speculation. So hopefully all of the good things we talk about will come to pass, and hopefully all of the things that might negatively impact the profession will be reconsidered or thought again and maybe not implemented. But again, we don't know what this is going to look like, and the impact isn't going to be felt for several more months. So we will just have to wait and see. All right, short and sweet on the intro today. Again, thank you to Amelia DeStefano for being on the episode and being our resident expert. Make sure to check out the show notes. I will have a link to the article that she wrote. And with that, enjoy this episode.
A tale of two hygienists.
Listeners, welcome to this week's tip episode. Before I introduce our guest here, I want to be very, very clear and transparent about the topic. This topic, I held off for several weeks in recording something because I wanted feelings and emotions to kind of just chill out a little bit on the heels of this election. The purpose of the tip episode is to kind of talk about some fundamental changes that may or may not be happening. It's not a scare tactic. It's not an endorsement of any of the political parties or anything like that. But there are some things that are definitely going to be impacted with President Trump's second term. And so our guest today is Amelia. Amelia wrote an article in Dentistry IQ about this. I'll put the link to that in the show notes. It's a really good read. But we're also going to talk about it a little bit today. So Amelia, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. I'm Amelia Williamson DeStefano. I'm the group editorial director at Dental Economics, RDH, and Dentistry IQ.
Man, that's a lot. You have so many.
It is.
So,
long name.
Before we get into kind of the point by point of the article that you wrote, I kind of wanted to kind of get your feelings and background. Like, how was this a difficult thing to try and be as objective as possible, just knowing how both parties, people have sensitive feelings about a presidential winner or not?
Yeah, I don't really get the chance to talk about politics very much in this industry because for the most part it just kind of goes along, and people have pretty diverse viewpoints anyway. Having dentistry be in the news is kind of unusual. But I think after the election, there was such a flurry of things coming out and people were talking about it anyway, that I just tried to condense it and make sense of what would be the biggest areas that Trump's second term could impact dental health care.
Yeah. So let's get into it. I'll kind of tee up every topic, and then if you don't mind, just kind of broad strokesing some of the things. Again, listeners, I think that you really need to read the article because I think it's just really smart. Let's start. Actually, we're going to save the big one for the last, I think, because that's probably a longer discussion. But the Affordable Care Act changes and dental insurance coverage, that was several paragraphs long. What changes could potentially be happening there?
Yeah, so Trump, in his first campaign and his first term, he did target the Affordable Care Act and tried to get it repealed or partially repealed, and that didn't really work out. I think some things were changed, but it wasn't substantively changed, and it's actually become a lot more popular as legislation over the years than it was when it first passed. So I don't think that any monumental changes will be coming, at least that's what he said. But there are a few things that they could do. There were some subsidies that were added as part of the coronavirus stimulus that are supposed to be expiring, and his administration may just let those expire. He could push to give states a little bit more control over what plans are offered and their own subsidy. He could add a work requirement to Medicaid and just generally do less outreach for enrollment for the ACA. I did find one study that said that the increase in coverage in the ACA did have kind of a spillover effect that improved dental health, even though dentistry wasn't a huge part of that legislation. So all of this is still a question mark, like a lot of what we're going to talk about today. People say things in the campaign that never really come to pass. This happens a lot. So right now, we don't really know, but I think there could be some minor but impactful changes coming.
I think it's, for better or for worse, I think that some people think that the president has like all power of the whole entire world. And like our government is a whole checks and balances thing. So it doesn't kind of matter what they say on the campaign trail. They want to get these things done, but a lot of times it's so hard to get a lot of this done. And it takes multiple parties, multiple majorities of parties to make this happen. So I guess,
Right.
again, that's mostly for the listeners of, hey, even when we're talking about these things, a lot of them might not actually even happen just because it's so hard to get things passed through Congress or through other agencies that need to have approval. So tangentially, though, there are other departments that could potentially be affected. And I wanted to talk about one specifically. So I want to talk again, and Amelia, I know you didn't cover this in the article, but like this is about the Department of Education. So there's lots of talk about, President Trump wants to, completely abolish the Department of Education. And I saw a post in, there's a Facebook group called Dental Nachos, and maybe you've seen this if you're in that group, but they talked about if that happens, this is actually what's going to happen. And I would encourage you all to go in and try and get into that Facebook group if you can. But the scary headlines are saying like, hey, student loans are like, no one's gonna be able to offer student loans anymore. Like education's going to be terrible. There's not going to be any systems in place. There's not going to be any programs in place to help anybody anymore. That's really not what they're trying to do. I think that this administration, for the most part, from what I understand, is they want to streamline. So rather than having two departments, they want to merge two different departments into one department to make it a little bit more efficient. And so that when things do come to pass, whether it's student loans or whatever, we're not having to bounce around between two different agencies to get this done. It's interesting also, I think that, he's appointed, or not appointed yet because he hasn't actually been installed, but he's already made several nominations, I guess, for these different departments. And have you thought about, like, do you have any feelings about some of the people that have been installed and how that might impact dentistry, or is this not really, is it too early to talk about that so far?
I think the cabinet picks, some of them have been kind of off the wall. And even the nomination process. I think there's a lot of, I guess, fear, for lack of a better word, because Republicans do have a majority in the Senate right now, but it's only 3 people. So you can see what happened with Gates, which was his pick for Attorney General. He was really controversial. He was embroiled in an ethics scandal in the House, and I think there was such an extent of pushback that he withdrew his nomination because they knew that that wouldn't get approved even with a small Republican majority. So these people have been nominated, but they have to be approved by the Senate. There was some suggestion that he being Trump, tried to push through the nominations with a loophole that if the Senate is in recess, then the president can install someone for 2 years without a formal nomination. The Senate could avoid that by not ever going into recess. So we'll see what happens. I mean, the biggest thing that the most controversial pick as far as dentistry goes is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Do you want to talk about him yet?
I want to keep teasing that
Not
just
yet.
a little bit longer
Okay.
because like that is going to be that's a big one. Let me. Sorry, I took us off track. Let me pivot us back on track. So in the article, you talk a lot about some tax policies that for dental M&A, mergers and acquisitions, which for the listeners who are kind of like, okay, mergers, acquisitions, that sounds boring stuff. It's actually kind of a really fascinating part of our industry where, it's mostly in the DSO space, but there is a whole subset of an industry within the industry of mergers and acquisitions. And it's very fascinating. And there are people making lots of money and there are people that are not doing so hot in this M&A space. What were you kind of talking about in the article about this?
Yeah. So we have a lot of contributors, especially in dental economics, that talk about merger and acquisitions, specifically dentists selling their practices, because at the end of the career, this is often the most valuable asset that they created, and they want to get the best price. Generally, Republicans are thought of being more friendly to people who are in this position because they might have lower capital gains taxes and estate taxes, things like that. We did have some contributors who characterized Trump's proposed tax policies as more favorable to dental practices who are looking to sell. I think Kamala Harris had said she was going to raise the capital gains tax. I'm not totally sure about that. And in general, the American stock market has gone up since Trump's election. I think generally business thinks it's going to be a more favorable environment. I will say that I don't think Trump is like what I would think of as a traditional Republican. He's kind of made his own brand that sometimes he has particular tax policies that are surprising. Like one thing that I think is kind of odd is that he's talked a lot about raising tariffs, which has a specific strategy for trade. But in the end, it's kind of just another tax because prices are going to go up for the consumer anyway. The company has to pay the tax and then they pass that on.
Yeah. So you said that kind of just nonchalantly because I think you understand this, but I want to kind of hit that point one more time just because I think that when a lot of us think about tariffs, we think of that being like a tax that, okay, so we'll say country A, because I don't want to offend any other country in this world right now.
Right.
But we'll say country A is importing stuff to the United States, is shipping stuff from their country into the United States. And we think that, oh, tariffs means that country A, all the companies inside country A, when they ship stuff to us, that if we put a tariff on it, they're going to have to pay extra. Oh, if you want to ship stuff to the United States, if you want to do business with us, you have to pay another 10%. But that's not what you're saying.
No, the people who are importing the product have to pay the tariff. So it just becomes more expensive. If you're going to get your gloves or your mask and you have to pay an extra like 20% because it's foreign made, the companies still want to make the same profit margin that they were making before. So they're just going to raise the prices for the consumer. The idea is that you want to give more of an advantage to domestic manufacturing because it's just more expensive to manufacture things here. And I do think there's a benefit to having more of our supply chain, especially for PPE in the United States, because that really came back to bite us during COVID. We really needed gloves and masks, and we just couldn't get them because we were so dependent on importing them from other places. So that, I think, for dental companies, I was at the Dental Trade Alliance meeting, which happened just after the election, and there are a lot of manufacturers there, and this is going to be a really big hurdle for them to figure out in the next year or two.
What is the correlation or the impact of that with like inflation? Because I feel like that's like the buzzword that happened during the election, right? Inflation, inflation, inflation.
Yeah.
We're scared about inflation.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, to me, it's like if you have to raise, if prices are going up on something,
That's
then
inflation. Right?
yeah.
But we don't get paid more as like individuals, right? So like it's just things are going to cost more basically at the end of the day.
Yeah.
If a tariff type plan of any sort of like substantial tariff goes into effect.
And I would, something that can happen is, country A and country B, they get in a tariff fight and say, well, you're going to put a tariff on me and I'm going to put a tariff on you. And we already have agreements with a lot of our trade partners already, and some of these tariffs may not be in line with those agreements. So I'm not really sure what's going to happen because I have never really looked into this kind of thing before.
Why would you? You never have to. The stuff doesn't really happen this way. Well, and the whole tariff war thing is just ridiculous because like at the end of the day, it's just the citizens of country A and country B being affected. It's not really big business. It's not really any, politician that's being affected, to any sort of substantial degree. It's the people. It's the, and so, okay, so going back to, for our dental offices, the cost of goods could potentially be more. Do you envision that we will be charging our patients more for the services that we are doing?
Yeah, I had not considered that. That's a really interesting question.
Just keep rolling that thing downhill, buddy. Let's just keep doing it.
I know. Well, I did see at the DTA meeting, Marco Vucic, I'm probably saying his name wrong, and I'm sorry, from the ADA Health Policy Institute presented. And he said that dentists have been feeling a squeeze this year because the reimbursements from insurance have not really gone up in the past couple of years, but the price of everything has gone up. And, patients are also feeling a financial squeeze, so they may be choosing treatments that don't have as big of a margin, or they may be delaying treatment. So this isn't really a great time for dental practices to have their costs go up.
Yeah. I think that there are, in dentistry, and I could be a little bit wrong on this, but I feel like there's a lot of good American-made products. There are some things overseas that come from overseas. Like you said, mostly like a PPE type thing. I think we have enough. I think actually my wife was telling me this morning, something like 30% of our medications are made overseas, or maybe even more than that, but maybe it's from one country in particular that would be impacted. So even the medications that we dispense or that we have our patients go and pick up if we're doing some surgeries or something like that in our dental practices, those are going to cost more. It's very fascinating kind of like what could happen. But I also think though, we do have a great amount of, between just North America, really, we have, between Canada and US, we have a lot of resources out there, lots of great big companies out there for a lot of different products.
Yeah, we do.
What I don't know is, do they get, so I was thinking about like the compounding, things that people get. Do the individual components of the products that they make come from overseas, and then they put it together and they send us? That I don't know. So
compounding pharmacies are just like I don't understand how they work. It's like you just go and you ask for the medication and it appears.
It's just like magic.
What happens back there? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. One thing though, I did look at when we were kind of prepping for this conversation, and we'll kind of get into this water fluoridation and RFK conversation, but it kind of has to do with the industry also, is that we talked about the stock market, right, going up lately. If you look at some of the dental companies, their stocks are ticking up. And if anyone's done the stock market, it's not really, it's not science, right? It's the I would say confidence of someone to think that something's going to happen in the future, right? But there is a large amount of confidence that dentistry is going to move into a certain direction, even if a tariff situation happens. And a lot of that falls on the appointment or the promised appointment to RFK. So do you mind talking a little bit about kind of what this appointment could mean?
Yeah. So I had not really, or I would say I didn't really know a lot about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. before this election. He did a lot of work as an environmental lawyer and accomplished a lot for clean water and holding big companies accountable for pollution and things like that. But then later on, he got involved in anti-vaccine advocacies. I've heard, I would say anti-vaccine advocacy. And I've heard him described as a conspiracy theorist. I know that he's been pretty vocally outspoken about the FDA. He says that they're not really doing enough to protect us from different contaminants or food ingredients in our food supply. And he views water fluoridation as adding an quote industrial waste end quote to the water supply. And he's already said, along with Trump, that he's gonna, if he's appointed, he will advise the United States communities, whatever authorities are in charge of the water fluoridation, to stop doing that in January. So he still has to be confirmed, but like with the stock market that you mentioned, dental stocks are going up. The investors are willing to bet that if water fluoridation declines, then more dental work is going to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting.
It's fascinating too. So I was in another Facebook group. Facebook groups are, obviously the lifeblood of our industry. And they were talking about, it was actually mostly dentists talking about this. And of course, there's the whole spectrum of opinion. And some of the interesting, I think, like key points that people are making. And again, I'm not advocating for one or another. I'm just stating what other people are stating. Is, the rights of the states to make the decisions. You mentioned that earlier about trying to kind of get people at more of a local level to make decisions. So municipalities can make their own decisions or things like that, which on the one hand, people argued would be a great boon to maybe the higher socioeconomic groups, that don't necessarily see as much of a benefit as the lower socioeconomic historically. That those ones could opt out of this, but that the ones that, were a little bit lower socioeconomic could still opt into this if they felt that there was a benefit to it. Then there was the other group of clinicians who felt that water fluoridation just itself is unnecessary because we just drink bottled water all the time, or purified water, or, we filter out the fluoride no matter what. There was another group who were really hard on acidic drinks, like everyone's drinking energy drinks and sodas and things like that. And so no amount of water fluoridation is going to help that. And then there's another group that really kind of zeroed in on the socioeconomic and there's a lot of pushback, like, oh, well, the poor people can't be smart enough to do this. Well, and that wasn't the issue. The issue was more the diet and the things that are affordable food wise are usually not the most nutritious. Even if you go down to the grocery store and you look through the fruits and vegetables, like those are so much more expensive than like a bag of chips, right? And so which is probably to RFK's kind of side of this, is like that inequity is not right. But there's something wrong there that we're doing that's the state of affairs right now. So it was kind of all over the board. Yeah. Making people sick and not just giving them any healthful foods. And so it's, I will kind of just say my own personal opinion a little bit on this one part is just like, I am hopeful because we've learned a lot the last several years about oral and systemic connections and links and things like that. I'm really hopeful that the things that do get implemented are really working towards taking out some of the unnecessary garbage that's in our foods. Um,
Right.
and I will agree with you on the fact that, he has done a lot in his life to fight against, the polluters and things like that and just environmentalist stuff. And I appreciate that he did that. I do have some concerns though about the anti-vax movement. I think that that's an interesting take, but again, it's not really for me to say like what someone else should do for someone else's kid, even though as a healthcare professional, we believe in vaccinations. And that's the thing that, so it's really polarizing, kind of weird, kind of interesting. Yeah. I don't know. But again, Henry Schein's stock went way up after all this happened. And so I was like, all right, so that's where people think is going to happen. People are going to come in with rampant decay.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about before this podcast was I don't really know if just doing simple fillings is all that profitable for a dental practice. You would probably know more about that. It seems more like crowns and bridges and that kind of stuff is more profitable, but that'll just be a few years down the line after people have all their
Right.
caries
No,
lesions. Eventually, they'll
exactly.
need a crown.
Well, and then the tariffs are coming in, so no one can afford the crown and Brit. No, just
I
kidding.
know.
No, I mean, you do have definitely have a point. I think, implants, surgical stuff, crown bridge is very profitable. I think any practice needs to have that to be able to sustain, the operations of the business. As a hygienist, of course, and not to get on my soapbox all of a sudden and just like tell you what's up, but I think the hygiene department is just grossly underutilized with the amount of disease that we see and the amount of untreated disease that ends up happening in most offices. You've been in a lot of these meetings. I've seen you, but like the AAP, right? American Academy of Periodontology has certain standards, and we'll just, for the sake of, whatever, 47% of Americans 30 plus have periodontal disease, but we're not, so half basically, but we're not doing half of our procedures as perio procedures. So
Right.
how does that make sense? Where it's like 10%. So how does 10%
Yeah.
make sense? Right.
Yeah, I know. And it's when you think about the level of untreated dental disease, it's mind-boggling. And, going back to like practices really not being able to make enough money this past couple of years, it just seems it's like the disease is definitely there, but it's stopping the treatment from happening. It's kind of could be underdiagnosis or people not having the money.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of all, there's so many financing options that are out there nowadays. I think there are practices that figured it out, right? I was
Mhm.
lucky enough to be a part of it for a while there. We were doing the right thing and getting the right results. And so I know there's a way. I hesitate to leave this because we're running out of time here, but leave this podcast and kind of like some sour notes here about like how it's going to be hard and difficult and things like that. But again, I guess I want to like temper everyone's expectations because like maybe we come back in a year and we do this again. We do like a recap of like, okay, it's been, the first 10 months or whatever, how's it gone so far. My assumption is that there's not really going to be a whole lot of change in this next year. I think this, like
Yeah, I
to
would
your
agree with
point, like
that.
there's going to be, even if they do implement something like removing fluoride from all of the water systems, that's going to take years to develop a real issue. And so we all just need to kind of be chill and like still love people and be happy. And like
Yeah,
we're clinicians and like just take care of your patient that's in the chair. Don't bring up politics and religion in the chair. That's always a good
always good
little
advice.
advice. So
Yeah. I mean, I will say that I think sometimes we put, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, we invest a lot of power into thinking like this particular politician can either make or break us. But I do think that just as individuals, we still have a lot more impact on how the country does than sometimes like the cable news wants us to think, because then we will stop watching the news. And I know, again, at the DTA, I keep bringing this up because I was just there, but they have an economic expert speak every year. His name's Brian Bolio. And he says that the GDP tends to go up the same amount no matter who's president. Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, it's like the economy is just kind of going along on it. It's affected by a lot of things, but there's not really like one individual person that has almighty power over it. So, I mean, that's just something to think about. I think, so much of it is still just unknown. Like we talk about all these cabinet appointments, they haven't even happened yet. So we'll just have to see. As a media person, I view our job as not to tell people what to think, but just give them information and they can decide.
I love it. Amelia, if someone wanted to reach out to you, maybe they have a good idea for an article or something, maybe they want to write for us, I don't know. What's the best email address to contact you by?
I'm on LinkedIn and my email is adestefano@endeavorb2b.com.
I'll make sure I put that in the show notes. Amelia, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew.
Yeah, this is a tale, oh yeah, a tale of two hygienists. So there might be only one, bringing the best of dental knowledge, and we do it all with ease. We cover oral health and screening, and preventing gum disease. We're gonna do a lot of learning, and have a little bit of fun working at the dentist. A tale of two hygienists.